So in this segment, we're going to cover the difference between the Hermetic Tarot images and modern oracle cards. Not all tarot cards are created equal, so here's the primary difference. Hermetic tarot cards are a collection of very specific images that don't really change from deck to deck, no matter what the artistic style of the deck happens to be. With very few exceptions, the magician, for example, will always be standing with one hand up to the sky and one arm pointing down to the ground. The emperor will typically always be sitting on a cube or some kind of a square cubical throne. He's never going to be floating in the air or climbing a tree or doing anything else as some other hypothetical fantasy tarot deck might represent him. The fool will usually always have a dog with him, as well as a purse that he is carrying over his shoulder on a stick. The high priestess is typically always going to be wearing a blue robe and holding a scroll in her lap. These images are made with very specific symbols in mind that mean very specific things which are relevant to the tradition that tarot is derived from, which is most likely, as far as anyone can speculate, primarily comes from the Kabbalah and its philosophy, but mixed in it is also bits of alchemy, astrology, and that sort of thing as well. So these basic images are really not going to change much from deck to deck as long as they are actually traditional tarot images. There might be some minor changes and artistic license taken by each individual artist of some of the more modern decks, but a knowledgeable tarot student can still see the traditional meanings present no matter what the subtle changes might have been, as long as the author of any particular deck is in the know about what the proper symbolism should be. And I will be discussing some of these subtleties in more depth in the online tarot course. One of the next things that I want to bring to your attention is that there are certain cases where in the traditional tarot decks there have been a couple of cards that have been switched in their numerical order. And one of the reasons for that is kind of a matter that's up for speculation. But for starters, Eliphas Levi was a French occultist. He was born in 1810 to 1875, and he is generally considered to be one of the first occultists in that era to have brought some of the older tarot images to light and made them accessible and available to people who later then became members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And his research kind of created the foundation on which the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley, Arthur Waite, Paul Foster Case, and others began to base their understanding of the tarot keys on the information that was provided initially by Eliphas Levi. So there was some debate on whether Eliphas Levi had the correct order of the cards to begin with, because it was speculated that even though Levi received the knowledge of the images, that he may not have been initiated into their secrets, and he may have been given the cards in a jumbled or out of order format. Nobody really knows for sure, but it is a speculation. So this left others who came after him to have the job of sorting out the proper order in which the cards needed to belong. It's most commonly accepted, usually by Arthur Waite and Paul Foster Case and those of the Golden Dawn magical system, that the Strength card is key 8 and the Justice card with the woman with the scales is represented as key 11. Now, Aleister Crowley switched the order of these two cards in his Thoth deck, and this most likely had to do a great deal with his own personal magical philosophy, which became the basis for his OTO teachings. So let me backtrack for just a second and say that the Justice card in most tarot decks typically sits in the key number 11 position and is considered to be at the center of the major arcana sequence. Now there's 22 cards in the major arcana, so 22 divided in half is 11, which makes the 11th card almost exactly halfway through the middle of the sequence. So there is symbolism there representing the center and the balance point. Now, Crowley switched these cards because of his magical philosophy, which was based in particularly in his philosophy of sex magic. So for Aleister Crowley, the strength card actually represented to him a card that should be in the central position of the deck because it was kind of the central focal point of his magical philosophy, in that she represented the Scarlet Woman, the woman with the beast. She represented the Scarlet Woman, and she was also known as the Whore of Babylon. And her sexual symbolism was that of a sacred prostitute. And so this whole sexual symbolism was the central key to his sex magic philosophy. The cards, the strength card also depicts a lion, and the red lion is an alchemical symbol, which is representative of the Kundalini force. And the Kundalini force, it is generally known among most magical practitioners, is pretty much one and the same as the sex force, the sexual libido, and the psychosexual spiritual energy. So he removes the strength card from position number 8 in Wadey's version of the deck, and he places her in the central position of number 11 in his Book of Thoth deck, making her once again the focal point for his pretty much his entire system of sex magic as a symbol. In most other decks, Justice is the card that sits in the number 11 position with her scales of balance. And in the Rider-Waite deck, for example, and in the Golden Dawn philosophy, for example, Justice is representative of the goddess Ma'at, who is the Egyptian goddess in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, who weighs the heart of the souls of the dead on her scales against her feather. And if the scales do not balance, if the heart is too heavy, then that particular soul is sent back to the lower realms once again to work out whatever karma that soul needs to work out, or to go back into the world of chaos and sort of be reintegrated into the great all that is and start all over again. This is a core philosophy in the initiatic texts of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So in order for the new Osiris, the new arisen Osiris man, to move forward through the underworld journey, he first has to have his heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and he has to be found to be pure and light of heart in order to move on to that next level of the resurrected Osiris and all of that symbolism that goes with that particular philosophy. So when you come across a tarot deck that represents the numerical switch which has been adopted by Aleister Crowley, which places the Strength card instead of the Justice card in the number 11 position, then you can pretty well assume that the author of that kind of deck is most likely going to be a practitioner of Crowley's system of magic and probably follows his philosophical school of thought. I know that the Scampini deck, for example, follows in the wake of Aleister Crowley's assignment of the cards. I'm not sure which other decks do. The Scampini deck is the only deck that I've ever had in my hands that I've seen this particular change in the numbers. I haven't actually owned too many. I didn't have an extensive tarot collection by any means. So I know there's others out there, but I'm not sure which decks they are. But it's something for you to pay attention to. And one of the reasons I bring this up to you is because there are some people who really, really, really do not like Aleister Crowley, and they do not like his energy, and they do not like anything about him. So those of you who are tarot readers or who know who Crowley is, if you don't like him and if you don't want to have any associations with his energy, you might want to consider being really mindful of this numerical sequence discrepancy because, as I said, anybody who's adopted that particular change in any of the more modern decks that have come out now are very likely followers of Crowley's system. So if you don't like Crowley, then you probably don't want to have the energy of anybody else who's following his system. So you just kind of have to decide for yourself how you feel about that. Some people are really into him. Some people can't stand him. I, for one, as a Golden Dawn occultist, I really appreciate a lot of the value that Aleister Crowley brought to the occult movement and a lot of the knowledge. So, you know, you take the good with the bad with Crowley. So, on that note, another fun way of looking at the major cards in the tarot and sort of seeing how, if you're going to play with this idea of the number 11 card being in the middle of everything, you can see in this next image of the next slide that is being presented to you, there's a particular layout where you can lay all of your major cards out with key 0 at the top, and then in rows of 3 horizontal lines all the way down vertically until you run out of your major cards. This is a particular pattern which was introduced by Paul Foster Case. Paul Foster Case initially was a member of one of the Golden Dawn lodges, and then he broke away and he created his own organization called Builders of the Adytum. And he had some pretty strong Masonic links in his personal experience of lodge working and very sort of Rosicrucian based teachings, and his Builders of the Adytum organization was basically a correspondence course for tarot and Kabbalah studies. Anyway, this particular layout was introduced by Paul Case, and it's a really interesting pattern to sit and study the cards as you're getting to know them, because you can rearrange the cards in all of these different patterns, and you can start to see how some of the images associate with each other in similar ways, or how they contrast in similar ways. And with this particular one, you can see that the 11 card is right smack in the middle of the whole layout, and that the layout itself is also suggestive of the Tree of Life diagram, which is shown on the left, to show you the compare and contrast with the key 0 up at the top and the 3 pillars of the Tree of Life in its vertical rows. So feel free to play with that one as you're getting to know your cards, and just sort of sit with that and study your cards a little bit, and just notice any peculiar insights that come to you as you study the images in relationship to each other. Modern oracle decks are not tarot. Tarot is a very specific title that is given to these images, and the etymology of the word itself is pretty important, so I want to talk about that for a second. So, translated into Hebrew, there's a specific cipher technique which is called permutation, and it's where you take the first letter of a word and you stick it at the end of the word, and then in the next row you keep doing that over and over and over again until you get back to the original first word. So you can see in the next slide the progression of how tarot is permutated in this way. Now, a permutation is a rotation, essentially, and the idea of rotation is suggestive, obviously, of the idea of spinning or of a spinning wheel. Now, if you look at one of the permutations that's derived from this technique, I think it's the second one, beginning with AROT, that particular word spelled backwards happens to mean, it translates as the law, and it is referred to as the Torah, which is an actual book in the Jewish tradition, and it consists of the 5 books of Moses, which make up the Old Testament in the Bible. So, this is one way of realizing how specific tarot imagery really can be. Now, a little note on Moses. So Moses, it was generally known, Moses is the one who received the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament, in the Bible. In the Judaic tradition, the 10 Commandments are understood as being the same thing as the 10 Sephiroth on the Tree of Life. So in the Judaic tradition, Moses actually received the Kabbalah and the knowledge that came with it. In the more Christianized version of the story, he's said to have received the 10 Commandments. It's basically the same thing. And so in this way, there's a very obvious symbolism and a very obvious link between the tarot images and the title given to the tarot images and the association with the Old Testament. So you can see how these older tarot images have some very strong Judeo-Christian associations in their meanings and in their imagery in some of these images, and also how they derive from even older schools of thought, which are based in Kabbalah and which are based in alchemy and astrology and so forth, which were given to us from the ancient world initially. So it's really important to understand that Kabbalah originally was an oral tradition. And it wasn't until the Kabbalah came into the hands of the Jewish people, very possibly during their captivity in Babylonia, I've read in some sources a while back, that the Jewish people, they didn't invent the Kabbalah, and it wasn't originally theirs as a culture, but they were actually the first to write it down, thus making it the first time that the knowledge of the Kabbalah had ever been translated into the written word. So there's that. So, the tarot of the cat people is not traditional tarot. The unicorn tarot deck is not traditional tarot. Angel cards are not traditional tarot. Animal oracle decks are not traditional tarot images. All of these other decks should not be called tarot because the term is technically incorrect. The term tarot should really only apply to this specific set of images that are being represented here, primarily in the Rider-Waite deck, and or other images that are very similar to it, at least. And the other decks should be called something else. They should be called oracle decks. Their images and their themes are based on entirely different cultures and entirely different mythologies and different cultural archetypes, which are not necessarily based in the Western occultism tradition. So one other note on the permutations is that if you look at one of the other permutations of the word tarot, when you get down to the part where it says ROTA, Rota is a word that I believe is Greek, and it actually translates also into the word in English, it means wheel. So again, we have this idea of the spinning wheels of the Sephiroth, the spinning wheel of the tarot. So there's this idea of spinning and spiraling and rotation that is infused throughout all of the Kabbalistic philosophy and even in the philosophy of our chakras and whatnot. So that's a really important association to keep in mind when you're studying these images. The best way to learn and familiarize yourself with these traditional images is to learn the tarot by using the Rider-Waite tarot deck, because this is the classic beginning tarot deck to familiarize yourself with these traditional older images on. This deck was published by Arthur Waite, who was a member of the original Order of the Golden Dawn, and it was illustrated by a woman by the name of Pamela Colman Smith. The Rider-Waite deck is also sometimes called the Rider-Waite-Colman deck, or the Waite-Colman deck, and it is because it's made up of these tarot images, which Wadey in his research was able to reconstruct from older sources, probably older sources that were given by Eliphas Levi. You can learn to recognize these images in other more modern decks, which are variations on the same Rider-Waite traditional images. And some of our modern decks have taken a great deal of artistic license away from the original tarot images. So if you really want to know your tarot, it's important to know the difference and to be able to identify which is which type of deck, and also understand what school of thought your tarot deck is drawn from. The first course in the introduction to my tarot class is going to explain in much more depth the differences between these two types of tarot decks and the differences in the approaches to using them. But then my focus for the rest of the class is going to be primarily on the traditional Hermetic tarot cards and not oracle cards.